Thanks for joining and welcome to our monthly webinar series for the National Park Service's Connected Conservation Initiative. My name is Brian Fainer and I'm with the National Park Service and help support the effort. Our Connected Conservation webinars focus on how NPS staff and partners can use various tools and strategies to conserve NPS resources at the landscape level. The webinar series is open to other feds, NGOs, and other partners, so feel free to forward future announcements to your colleagues. We hope we host a webinar at least once a month, and you can find recordings of past webinars on our internal NPS Connected Conservation Toolkit, as well as the Network for Landscape Conservation website, and there's links to both of those resources in the chat box. Also, FYI, the Connected Conservation Toolkit is only accessible to DOI staff, but the Network for Landscape Conservation website is open to everyone. We will post a recording of today's webinar following the presentation. It may take a week or so. And throughout the presentation, feel free to plug in questions into the questions box. We will host a question and answer session following the presentation and read aloud any questions that have been submitted. And I'm sure we'll have many. Today's presenter is Jody Olson, who serves as the Senior Director of Federal Relations for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. During his 16 years with NFWF, Jody has worked with each of the Foundation's federal agency partners. He is currently responsible for overseeing new partnership development and serving as the Foundation's primary liaison with the federal land management agencies and the Department of Defense. Jody also works closely with NFWF's corporate development team to secure private funding to support the goals of our federal partners. Jody, with that, the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you very much, Brian, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak to you today. So I'm probably not supposed to say this, but by way of introduction, I've always had an affinity for the Park Service, and I've visited many of our national parks as a child, and actually just got back last month from taking my kids on a spring break trip to the Big Five parks out in Utah. So just want to say I really appreciate the work that you and all of your partners do on the ground, because it's some incredible places in this country. So today, what I want to do is I want to highlight the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, otherwise known as NFWF. And I know some of you are probably wondering why you should care about NFWF, the Foundation for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the short answer is it's because we're so much more than that. So this afternoon, I will provide a brief overview of NFWF, discuss our grant-making model, our history with the National Park Service, and opportunities that exist to apply for grant funds or to partner more formally on programs with the Foundation. So with that, let me go ahead and advance the slides here, and we'll talk a little bit about our history. So NFWF is fairly similar to the National Park Foundation. We were created about 2 decades later. And we were established to be the official foundation for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then 10 years after that, we also became the official foundation for NOAA. But the key distinction between us and the National Park Foundation, as well as the National Forest Foundation, is that instead of being given kind of the directive to work specifically for Fish and Wildlife and NOAA, we were given the charge to work on the mission of both of those agencies. So our charge is to support fish, wildlife, plant, and ocean conservation. And that allows us to work across the landscape with multiple federal agencies and private lands, and makes us a little bit more unique than the other foundations. And then how we go about doing that work is primarily through our grant making. And we work very closely with our federal partners and others on developing programs that I'll get into here in just a minute, and using a competitive process to solicit grants. And then NFWF manages those grants and reports back to both our board, that as you can see includes both the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the NOAA administrator, as well as back to our agency partners. And historically, the value that we've really added was around leverage, we're working to bring new funding to conservation to support the work of our federal agency partners. But increasingly, we're transitioning to really focus on outcomes and metrics. And that's part of the presentation that I'll get into here in just a minute. So our model is a little bit more unique than the National Park Foundation, which is focused a lot more on bringing in resources specifically to the Park Service. Our model is about bringing in resources to those large conservation priorities of our partners. And so typically what will happen is a federal agency or one of our corporate partners will come to us with a landscape challenge or potentially an issue or a species where they think being able to bring in the private sector will allow them to advance their conservation goal. And we'll sit down with that partner and try to figure out exactly what outcomes it is they want to see on that landscape. And then we'll try to map out, who are the other federal agencies within that landscape that might have an interest in this geography or species. Who are the corporations and foundations, potentially large private donors who might also have an interest. And we'll try to go out and bring in those other resources. And then we'll bring everyone together around a table and we'll sit down and we'll talk about what we want to see happen on that landscape. And most of the time we find that amongst all of the various parties, about 80% of the goals align across the various entities. And so we really build a grant program then based on that 80% of kind of shared conservation outcomes, allowing still for opportunities to solicit projects that address the specific needs then of each of the other federal funding partners. And then what we do is taking this information, we work through our science staff and the science staff of the partners to build a business plan. And these plans basically identify the outcomes that we want to see accomplished over a 10-year period and the specific actions that we're going to fund during that 10-year period. And then NIFWF manages competitive grant programs where we solicit projects, we bring together all of the funding partners to rank and review and select the projects, and then NIFWF manages those projects. So that's the core way that we operate. In terms of our partners, as I've mentioned, because we work kind of across multiple landscapes, we have partnered with about 25 different federal agencies over 7 different cabinet level departments over our 36-year history. We did have a brief partnership with the Park Service back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. As you can see right now, we partner with many of the Department of Interior agencies, USDA, NOAA, as well as the Department of Defense and some of the various branches there. And then just like the National Park Foundation, a lot of our work is about bringing new funding in for conservation. And as you can see, this is an example of some of our corporate partners. A lot of them either focus kind of in the extraction world, or they focus in that urban setting, and they're looking for opportunities to touch their customers, folks like FedEx and Wells Fargo and Walmart. And then increasingly for the foundation, foundations have been another source of funding that we've been able to bring in for our programs. And if you looked at the foundation 8 years ago, we did not have a single federal or a single foundation partner. And the reason why is that typically foundations don't want to give money to another foundation. Typically foundations do the grant making themselves. But increasingly, as we've been able to really focus in on outcomes, we've been able to go back to other foundations and tell them, look, we could provide the outcomes that you're looking for on the ground, plus we have the ability to leverage your money at a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratio to get a lot more work done on the ground. And that's allowed us to attract a lot of foundation partners over the last couple of years as well. So just to give you a sense of kind of the size and scale and the, why should you care? If you look at the last couple of years for the foundation, we've been awarding over $300 million of direct grant funds over these last couple of years. And partly that is due to the fact that we are managing some of the BP, Deepwater Horizon settlement funds in the Gulf. But if you do look at the chart below, you will see that overall the amount of federal funding that the foundation has received, as well as the corporate and foundation funding that we've been receiving, has been increasing over the years. And it's given us an opportunity to not only expand our geographies, but to really meet the key investments in those geographies that need to happen if we're going to be able to move the needle. So in terms of where we make some of these investments, as you can see throughout our history, we've made investments throughout the country. And we have some core areas, and I'll show you another map that shows our key investment areas now. But I want to make sure that you're aware that even when you see our map of kind of where our priority investments are, we still have a lot of national level programs that make investments in different places throughout the country. And we have mitigation or kind of one-time programs that pop up every year. And so even if you don't see an area where you're located having received a lot of grants or in our kind of priority focal areas right now, it doesn't mean that in 3 months or 6 months, there's not going to be a funding opportunity that might align with your interests. So I alluded to the fact that we've gone through this transition to focus a little bit more on outcomes. And really what happened was we hit the $1 billion in on-the-ground conservation mark about 15 years ago. And at that point, it was kind of the money that NIFWF had put out along with grantee match. And our board chairman came to us and said, "This is fantastic. What are all of the species that you have helped remove from the endangered species list? And what are the key landscapes that you have completely transformed?" And so we sat down as a staff and tried to look at this, and we realized that there was very little that we could claim true credit for. We had funded a lot of really good projects across the landscape, but collectively those projects, it was hard to measure the conservation impact of those investments. And so he really pushed us to bring on a full science staff. And we now have PhD leads for a lot of our programs, as well as a full evaluation team that have helped us develop a process to better be able to quantify the outcomes of our investments. And so, as I mentioned earlier, kind of all of our programs go through a process where we sit down and we work on developing a business plan. And that could be a very detailed 30, 40-page document, or for some areas, it could be just a very simple 5 to 10-page document. But it's something that maps out tangibly what those outcomes are that you want to see on the ground, what those threats are that are inhibiting us from achieving those outcomes, and what are the specific actions that we want to be able to fund in order to reach the outcomes on the ground. And having that kind of roadmap is key, not only for potential applicants to see what's going to be competitive, but for us to be able to go back and measure whether or not we're having success. Another thing that we did, and you'll see if you were to apply for a project from NIFWF, is for each of our programs, we've developed some key metrics that we want our applicants to capture. So if you're working on a fish project, there will be a couple, 3 or 4 metrics on a drop-down list, and we really want you to focus in on those metrics. Now, if you want to add some extra metrics outside of that, you're totally welcome to. But by having these core metrics, it ensures that, and all these metrics align to our business plan, it ensures that we're getting results that lead to the outcomes we wanted to see articulated in our business plan. And it also ensures that we're getting metrics that allow us to compare across programs at an apple-to-apple level. And then finally, we try to come back in and we do some evaluation. And so we have an internal evaluation team that goes in and does an assessment of all of our programs at the 3 to 4 year mark and makes some recommendations on tweaks. And then for our really large programs, we try to come in every 10 years and hire an outside evaluation firm to come in and look at the programs and help us determine what's working, what's not working, and how we could improve the program moving forward. So where we stand now is we've got some key landscapes where we're making the majority of our investments. And within each of these landscapes, we've identified some indicator species that we're focusing on. And most of these species are kind of high-level species where we know that these are the species that will respond to the habitat improvements that we're hoping to see put on the ground. And that these species are indicators that if they're benefiting, we know there's a whole suite of other species under them that should also be benefiting. And you'll see the dark green. These are programs where we have a full business plan that's available on our website. And the ones that are in light green are ones where we're currently in the process of developing a business plan, or we have just a very a light version of the business plan in place right now. And this map is constantly evolving as we do our evaluations and as potential funding changes. And so just one thing I would want to highlight is right now our Northern Rockies and sagebrush programs. We also just launched a new migrations program this past year. And in part because of that, we're in a process now of looking at potentially combining all three of those efforts into a new Rocky Mountain rangeland program that would come online sometime in the year ahead. That would encompass that entire geography, plus a little bit more into Nevada and Utah. So this is something that evolves based on kind of the funding that's out there and the results that we're getting on the ground. So I'm sure all of you actually care more about kind of the direct impact to the Park Service. So I want to take a minute here and highlight our work with the Park Service. So I just tried to go back and look at our grant making over the past 10-year period. And as you'll see, we've awarded about $15 million through 144 grants that have been directly on or have benefited National Park Service lands. And out of those, about $4.5 million was awarded directly to Park Service units, with the rest going to friends organizations or some of the large national conservation groups who were then doing work on the Park Service lands or immediately adjacent to the Park Service lands that provided those benefits. And the thing that actually surprised me the most was in looking at it, there was actually 24 different grant programs over this 10-year period where applicants were successful in getting funding to support work. So once again, just encourage you to continually check the NIFWF website because we're always coming out with new programs, and there's numerous opportunities to try to bring resources to your unit. Some of the programs that kind of stood out the most, a lot of them were around some of that resilience work, both through Hurricane Sandy and then the Gulf through the settlement fund. But we also have done a lot of work around seabirds in Hawaii and invasive species work and native plant work kind of historically. So in terms of applying or even thinking about what that process would be in order to secure funding from NIFWF, the first thing to do is to kind of check out what programs we have that are currently available. You saw the key landscapes that we're focusing on, but we also have a lot of programs that I mentioned earlier that are either nationwide or are kind of a one-time program or kind of a mitigation fund program. So there's always a lot more programs than what that map shows. And you can find our programs by either in the yellow circle on our website up there, it says apply for a grant. That's got information both on all of our programs as well as a link to all of our business plans. Or you could, under that red circle where it says conservation programs, you could just click that button and it'll take you directly to the list of all of the programs that are kind of currently active in soliciting projects during this past year period. And that'll give you a better sense of where the funding opportunities are. So if you see something that looks like it might align with your goals, after you've read it, the next thing to do is to really reach out and talk to the appropriate NIFWF staff. And because metrics is really how our board is defining our success, our staff is really driven to try to bring in those projects that are best going to accomplish those outcomes. And so we really want to proactively work with our applicants to make sure that they're coming in with the right kind of projects that are meeting the goals that we need to see. So we want to work with you on developing that strong application. And we want to be fair and honest and not have folks, spend a lot of time applying if it's not going to be a good fit. So, we'll talk through your project and we'll be honest with you if it's just not something that's going to work. The second thing I want to point out, particularly for the Park Service, is most of our funding comes from obviously other federal agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, BLM, and there is just a natural tendency of those agencies to not want to fund work of another federal agency. That's just kind of inherently natural for all of us. Not to say it doesn't happen, but one thing you want to look for are those programs where we do have corporate or foundation partners, and on all of our program pages we have the logos of the funders right there in front of you. It's going to be a lot more likely that we'll fund work directly on the Park Service lands, through some of the private funds. But then as I was looking at those projects that did receive funding from other federal agencies, and there definitely were a significant number that did, there was two things that really stood out. One is for those programs that had some of our Fish and Wildlife Service funds, really being able to articulate the species benefits that were going to be accrued from that project was something that got the Fish and Wildlife Service representatives on the committee interested enough in supporting that project. And then those projects that had that cross-boundary appeal. So if you've got adjacent BLM lands or Forest Service lands, working on designing that project that encompasses work on both the Park Service lands as well as the adjoining other federal agency lands is another thing that is more likely to attract funding. And then clearly, working with your friends groups or a key NGO partner, it removes that inherent bias of seeing, the Park Service as the applicant, it also provides opportunities for increased match, where those other groups could help bring in some resources as well. And then finally, as I've alluded to a lot during this presentation, obviously metrics is key. And so, really thinking about those specific metrics and how you could write your proposal towards, demonstrating those outcomes are kind of going to be the things that we look at as we're ranking and reviewing those projects. So then, in terms of some of the programs, I'm only calling out 6 here. There's numerous programs that I think have a direct connection to Park Service units. These ones just kind of stand out in my mind, either because we have made some significant investments through these programs or because I see a lot of Park Service units that kind of intersect with these programs. One of the newest programs, we just launched it this past year, is our Western Migrations Program. This is about implementing the secretarial order on migrations. So it's really focused on the state-identified migratory corridors for mule deer, elk, and pronghorn antelope. The next one is our Coral Reef Conservation Fund. This supports a lot of work in some of the island territories, as well as Hawaii. And it's a lot of the work is focused on those upstream kind of nutrient and sediment reduction projects that will then benefit the downstream coral reefs. So work up on the Park Service lands and other lands is something that's highly supportive. The Seabird Program, this is fairly specific to kind of the Hawaiian Islands, but there are some other opportunities up in Alaska as well, where focus on restoration and protection in particular of habitat on Park Service lands is key to the survival of these seabirds. Bring Back the Natives focuses on native trout conservation, heavy emphasis on the West, but it's a nationwide program. And there's definitely opportunities around, Yellowstone cutthroat trout and others that we've invested in where it's been on Park Service lands. I think that the biggest pot of potential funding, both historically and moving forward in the future, is around resilience. So the foundation is still going to be awarding Gulf settlement funds over the next 5 to 8 year period. We've awarded some large projects to units in the Gulf, and there's opportunities to have more of an impact through that program. But we also have a $30 million partnership with NOAA around coastal resilience, and this is looking kind of nationwide at improving the resilience for both communities and wildlife. And I think there could be some real tangible opportunities to align with some Park Service goals through that program. And then finally, I wanted to call out fire because once again, as we talk about resilience and kind of the challenges that we're all going to be facing with the changing climate, fire is increasingly a threat we have to deal with. And we've got some programs specifically focused on fuels management efforts, both in California with Forest Service and CAL FIRE, as well as in the Southeast and with a lot of the private forest lands in that geography. And so I think there's some real opportunities for alignment there. And then I want to conclude with talking about a more direct partnership with NIFWF. As you saw, we have 15 current federal agency partners running the gamut, across the country. The Park Service has not been one of those foundation partners, and I think one of the primary reasons is just we haven't engaged in dialogue. I think there's some real opportunities to look at where there are, where we could bring in some resources. Obviously, never wanting to step on the toes of the National Park Foundation, but where we have some programs that align specifically with some of the species or geographic needs of Park Service units. I think we have the ability to potentially have Park Service join in on some of these programs, and that provides the opportunity to help work on the annual solicitation for the request for proposals, to be there during the proposal review and scoring process, and to be able to help direct not only where those Park Service resources go, but really to help influence where some of the other partners help direct their funding. The other opportunity is around kind of the management of mitigation funds. And after having developed this presentation and going in and trying to do a little bit more research on the National Park Foundation to just get a better sense of where we differ, I've come to see that they do a pretty good job of managing mitigation funds on behalf of Park Service units. So definitely we don't want to kind of step on their toes on that one. But I think if there's some opportunities to look at some landscape scale mitigation efforts that are both on and then off Park Service lands, I think there's another opportunity to potentially partner with NIFWF. So that's a little bit about kind of who we are, how we've worked with the Park Service, and kind of ways to get engaged, both as being an applicant and trying to solicit some funding, as well as partnering directly with NIFWF and kind of putting some funding into some of our programs and helping us implement those activities on the ground. And I think with that, I'll go ahead and open it up for some questions.
Thanks again, Jody, for an awesome presentation. Again, folks, if you have questions for Jody, please enter them into the questions tab on your GoToWebinar bar there, and then I'll read them to Jody. We've got one here, Jody, for you. Does NIFWF fund research or on-the-ground projects, or perhaps a combination where research may lead to a project?
Yeah, I'd say the vast majority of our funding is kind of direct on-the-ground funding, for actual kind of dirt moving based projects. But we do have some limited grants for research, particularly where it helps drive management action and where it helps fill in gaps. And so for some of those programs that were still the light green, where we're in that process of building the business plan, that's one of the first steps that we take, is trying to look at what those data gaps are that we really need to get a better handle of before we develop that full business plan. And we'll typically try to put out a couple of small grants to try to fill those needs. So, if you're looking for research funds, we're not the best spot, but if it aligns with some of those program areas, there might be some opportunities.
Great. So it looks like the grants go to both the feds and to other partners like NGOs. For NIFWIF's review process, is there any preference? I mean, is it for parks? Or is it better for some of these grant proposals to come from like a Friends of XYZ National Park, or is it just as good for it to come from a park itself?
Yeah, so how our process works is basically all of the funders have a seat at the table. So, the projects will come in, they'll be provided to each of the funders to go through a review and ranking process, and then we'll bring all of the funders back together along with all of the combined scores. And typically what happens is, there's a set of, 10 or 15% of the projects that just everyone had ranking high, and we know we want to fund, and we figure out who's going to put funds towards each of those projects, and we kind of get those knocked out. And then there's those, maybe 20% of projects at the bottom that, have, everyone for the most part has kind of scored poorly, and those kind of drop out. And then we've got the rest of those projects, which are all usually pretty good projects, but we know we just don't have enough money to meet that need. And so we sit down and have the detailed discussions around those projects. And from NIFWIF standpoint, we're trying to find the projects that meets the outcomes that best meet those outcomes, and that's what we're trying to push for. But each of the funding partners, have a voice in terms of where their funds go. And so, I spoke to that natural bias that, a Fish and Wildlife Service employee who's providing a ranking, and they're between a project that's the National, Park Service, or a project to Trout Unlimited. Some folks have a little bit of a bias against other agencies, and some don't. It just depends somewhat on the reviewer. And so I would say an application that came through a friends group or another partner would remove that bias. And so, there's a slight chance that it might do better because of that. Particularly if that partner was able to bring additional leverage, then I think it definitely would kind of raise that project up. But at the end of the day, at least from NIFWIF's perspective, what we care about is the outcomes. And so if a Park Service unit could apply directly and produce those outcomes, that's the project that we're going to be pushing the hardest for.
Along the same lines, how common is it for multiple feds to put forward a proposal, like Fish, Wildlife, and say BLM?
So, each of our federal agencies on the ground, we typically do see them apply for projects. It's usually, kind of discrete. And so, once again, in terms of, funding, a lot of it depends on kind of what ends up scoring the highest, or what, NIFWIF really feels is best aligned with the goals of the business plan. In terms of behind the scenes, though, kind of flipping that question around in terms of the funding, a lot of times we try to co-fund projects as much as possible, and we really look for those projects that aren't just a Forest Service project, or aren't just a Park Service project, but really are those kind of broader landscape projects. I think that's where we feel that with our breadth, we add that value, or on those cross-jurisdictional projects where we could come in with NRCS as a partner and do work on the adjacent private lands as well as work on those federal lands. And so we're always looking for kind of behind the scenes opportunities to bring funding from multiple federal agencies and private funders, our corporate and foundation partners, to be able to fund a grant. So typically a lot of our grants have 2 or even 3 funders who are paying in for the project.
What is the typical timeline or time frame from beginning to end, I guess, for a grant process?
Yeah, our typical grant program runs about 8 months altogether. And a lot of programs, it includes, the launch of the RFP. Many programs have a pre-proposal stage, which is just a really short kind of 2-page description of the project, just to make sure we weed out those projects that are definitely not going to qualify. And then we have the full proposal process, a review process, The thing that slows us down a little bit is we have a congressional requirement that all of our grants have to go through a 30-day congressional review period. So that adds just a little bit of time to our overall process. But it's typically, depending on the program, between 6 and 8, 9 months is from start to finish is our process. And then in terms of our grants, most of our grants are usually 2 to 3 years.
Great. Does NIFWF work with the Indian tribes?
The Indian tribes are grantees of ours. A lot of our awards go to tribal entities or to organizations who are partnering with tribal entities. We do not have any funding from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, however.
Okay. Is it also accurate then that you guys occasionally would work with the Bureau of Reclamation and some of the other DOI bureaus that are sometimes under the radar?
Absolutely. So Bureau of Reclamation actually, in terms of just pure funding, is probably our largest DOI funder. A lot of it came through one specific program. But we have 3 active partnerships with the Bureau of Reclamation. So they are definitely a partner of ours. We've got then active partnerships with the Bureau of Land Management and Fish and Wildlife Service. We also, it just ended this past year, but the last 3 years we've had an active partnership with USGS. And historically, we had a partnership with the Office of Surface Mining as well. So we've definitely worked kind of across the Department of Interior.
Okay. Let's see here. Are there any limitations, I mean, without getting into the weeds with some of the grants, for the types of tools, I guess, that some of the projects may include in their proposal, such as, are there any prohibition on buying land or conservation easements or anything like that that NIFWF has as a part of their grants?
Yeah, so each one, I think it depends a little bit on the program and particularly the funder. We have a lot of programs. In fact, NRCS is historically always one of our top 3 funders. A lot of their funds are used to support easements. And we support kind of easements through a lot of our traditional programs with our federal funds. We don't do as much on the acquisition side, even though we do have some programs, including our partnership with Walmart, which is dedicated 100% towards acquisitions. That one has actually supported some acquisitions, I know within the Grand Tetons, I believe 1 or 2 other parks. And that's a great program. I'll just quickly put in a plug for it. Once again, it's called Acres for America, and Walmart initially, now about 12 years ago, had committed to offset their footprint in terms of all of their stores and warehouses, which I believe at the time was something like 146,000 acres. They made a commitment, a really significant commitment of funding. And we've been able to go out and over that first 10-year period through the Walmart funds and funds from other partners, they were able to secure over 1 million acres on the ground, both in terms of easements and acquisitions. And they've now kind of recommitted to that partnership. So there's definitely some opportunities there. The other thing I would highlight is, that's one of the advantages of bringing multiple federal partners to the table around a shared pot, is that, every partner has their own authorities and restrictions on funding. And a great example is we have this program called our 5-Star program, and it's kind of our small community program. The goal really is to, try to bring 5 different partners together to support a community-based project. And we've got some funding from 2 different pots of money within EPA. And in one of those pots, the money could only be used for on-the-ground work. And in the other pot, the money could only be used for non-on-the-ground activities like planning and education. We also have some Forest Service funding that specifically could only be spent on kind of private forestry work. And so in a lot of the cases, behind the scenes within one project, we're using a little bit of the non-implementation EPA funds to support some community education work, while using some of the EPA implementation funds to support some of the restoration work, as well as if they're doing some tree planting, bringing in some of the Forest Service funds. So, kind of behind the scenes, we're kind of fitting the jigsaw of authorities together to make these projects whole. So, if one funder is not able to support acquisitions because of some restriction, ideally, we're trying to bring in another funder that can support it if that's one of the goals of that geography and that program.
Wow, that's great. Do you all fund projects using traditional ecological knowledge? I guess kind of looking at the cultural resource component.
Yeah, I would say, the cultural side doesn't rank as high, I think, for a lot of the NIFWF programs. I think we kind of come at it a little bit more from that traditional Fish and Wildlife Service NOAA lens of kind of just the pure fish and wildlife and habitat response. I know, depending on where we work, particularly if we're working in Hawaii or in Alaska, engagement with the Alaska Natives is absolutely critical, and a lot of our efforts up there are about kind of engaging the local natives into the conservation programs that we're running. So in that sense, we try to involve some of that kind of that cultural aspect, but unlike I think the Park Service, where a lot of the mission is on some of those cultural resources, ours is really much more focused purely on the fish and wildlife side.
Okay. Are you guys engaged with the Network for Landscape Conservation?
Yes, we are not. I mean, I know our staff have been involved. Unfortunately, I have not been a part of that, and so I don't know how involved we are, other than I know I've heard folks within our office talk about it, and so I know at some level there is some engagement. I unfortunately am not able to fully articulate, kind of how deeply engaged we are.
No, that's fine. This is a similar question. Can you expand on the landscape programs mentioned earlier in your presentation? I mean,
sure, and I'll see if I could go back to that slide. So, as I mentioned, kind of the transformation that happened at NIFWF, and I'll just kind of go into this in a little bit more depth. So when we looked at our grant making back about 12 years ago, and we discovered that we were doing a lot of really good grants around the country. We had a really detailed review process with our federal agency partners, but at the end of the day, they were kind of that 1,000 acts of random conservation kindness, right? It was like a really good grant here, and then another really good grant there, but collectively they didn't add up to anything. And as we all know, if you're going to make a difference on a landscape, you have to be investing in that landscape over the course of 10 or 20 years. And so we kind of went through a process. I think so much of DC in particular, but I think just life. It's I equate it to a pendulum, right? We were kind of on one side of the pendulum. Our pendulum swung 100% to the opposite side, where we then looked at what are kind of those key species that we had been investing in historically, where we had partners on the ground who were able to work on those species, where we truly felt we could move that needle for that species over a 10-year time frame. And so we really worked on developing those really detailed business plans for those species. But what we discovered was we had a really good plan for how to move the species forward, but we lost a lot of the funding that we had in that, when you get so narrowly focused, it's hard to appeal to a corporation or a foundation or to even a federal agency partner who has much broader interests. And so eventually, over the last couple of years, we've really kind of, the pendulum's kind of finally settled in I think that perfect sweet spot, which is where we've identified these large landscapes where we really feel that we could help improve the condition of that landscape over a 10-year period. But we're doing that by measuring that specific species response of a couple targeted species, because as we all know, you could go out and you could restore an acre and, so what? It's got to be kind of the right acre. And by measuring the species response, you're getting some indication that you're actually doing the right types of conservation work on the right acreage. So these are the kind of the current landscapes where we're investing. Most of these have been developed in partnership with our federal funding partners. There's some partner, whether it's a federal agency or a corporation, that is really interested in that geography and was willing to kind of put that anchor funding into place. And then we've been able to build from there and bring additional resources to bear because of that funding. And so, like I said, this isn't comprehensive of all of our programs. We've got a lot of national programs as well. And, we're always in discussion with agencies as political priorities change or as new corporate partners come on board to look at other geographies within this landscape that we might go. But these are kind of our current focal areas right now.
Great. All right, last question. What role, or if any, do the various different types of land designations make in grants getting funded or being competitive? For instance, is it helpful, obviously, to include, the benefits to a park, but also to, say, a wild and scenic river or a national scenic trail, or it's a biosphere reserve, something along those lines? So do those types of designations help?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely doesn't hurt. And as you're looking at, those projects kind of in the middle and you're trying to figure out, an investment, here or an investment there, which one is going to get you the greatest return. Sometimes those other intangibles are important. A lot of times if lands have that extra kind of level of protection, there's going to be a little bit potentially more permanency to the restoration work that you're doing. So I think it is something that's definitely looked at. But I think the primary driver for most of our grants is looking at both kind of the leverage that's brought to the table as well as the specific outcomes that are brought to the table.
Great. All right, Jody, any last words?
Well, I would just, encourage anyone who has additional questions, to please reach out and talk to me, and I could definitely put you in contact with the appropriate staff here at the foundation, who kind of, is responsible for work within your landscape or on the issue that you care about. In terms of, potential grant opportunities, and if there are some areas where there might be some interest for Park Service units to kind of get engaged, either kind of at the individual level, or if there's kind of a species challenge that crosses multiple parks, and the potential to have some funding kind of rolled up at kind of that regional level or even national level to help support some of these efforts. It definitely would be happy to have those conversations about how we could better partner with the Park Service.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jody, for taking the time out of your busy week and life working with NIF on all these different grants. It's definitely, it seems like there's a lot of opportunities there, and it could be a little overwhelming, but I think with your presentation today, it's a little bit more clear. And again, folks, this is recorded, so we're going to post this to our internal Park Service Connected Conservation Toolkit. It'll also be posted to the Network for Landscape Conservation website. So I again encourage you to share the recording with your colleagues. and look and register for future webinars. Our next webinar is on June 11 at 3 o'clock, and it's on the connectivity of the North Country National Scenic Trail. And that's a joint presentation between the North Country Trail Association and the National Park Service. And again, you can register for that webinar on the toolkit and on the Network for Landscape Conservation website. All right, well, thanks everyone, and thanks again, Jody.
Thank you.
Take care.